One has to realize that on the worldwide scale, there was an improvement in the living standards, but not evenly distributed.
O Brasil entrevista hoje o professor Švejnar. Ele é um economista da República Tcheca, radicado há muitos anos nos Estados Unidos, onde dirige atualmente o Centro de Governança Econômica Global da Universidade Columbia. O professor Švejnar tem doutorado pela Universidade de Princeton em Economia e foi candidato à presidência da República Tcheca há 7 anos. Professor, thanks so much for being with us today.
Thank you for having me.
I'll start asking you about how do you see the balance of state intervention in, especially in emerging markets, economies overall? Is it possible to say if it's like overall we have like more positive results than negative results, or does it depend on the situation and on the experience of each country?
Yeah, it depends. I think it's good to start with the recognition that the state is needed, that it's impossible to have a market economy just operating totally without state being there and providing the assistance that's needed. I think the real trick is how to find the right combination so that the state is enabling, it helps, it improves the functioning of the market economy, but doesn't hinder it. So it's the right amount, but also the right type of state intervention. In a way, one would want to have the smart state, or to go back to Plato, the philosopher king, sort of the state that really does good things, and at the same time doesn't hamper the market system, the functioning of labor markets, of capital markets, of the product market, and so on. That's of course very difficult, and that's what economics as a profession is in a way all about.
In the case of Brazil, I don't know how closely you follow the situation here, but we are like in a deep recession for almost 2 years now, and many specialists see the excessive government intervention, especially since mid-2000s, as one of the main reasons of the current recession. Do you agree with this point of view?
So I'm not a Brazil specialist, but I do follow the situation here, and I do follow other countries. So I have sort of a comparative advantage, if you want, perspective on what's happening. My sense is that Brazil is an economy that has an incredible positive potential. So that in a way the question is how to realize that potential, and in a number of instances in the past, Brazil's economy has done exceedingly well. So the question is what's been happening. My sense is that Brazil has kind of added government tasks one to another, so that over the last 7 decades, the government has become in a way bigger and bigger and got more and more tasks. Now many of the functions that the government has performed and is performing have been very good in the sense that some poverty has been reduced, education level has increased dramatically, the sort of protection of the elderly, handicapped, and so on has improved. So that all is good. I think what's the problem is that in a way the growth of these services and government provision has grown faster than the economy itself. So that the economy has become more and more indebted. The government has accumulated more and more debt and is currently proceeding on a path that is not sustainable. So obviously the crisis that has hit over the last 2 years has been very severe and has made things more difficult. On the other hand, the many years before have shown that the economy can grow very well, be involved in international division of labor, and so on. So I think the question is how to bring the economy back. Part of the problem is external, that the world economy has not been doing so well. Part of it is internal in terms of the structure. The good thing is that unlike many other economies, the banking sector still seems to be in a relatively good shape, capitalized, has liquidity. The central bank is pursuing reasonable policies. Most recently, over the last few months, we see the inflation rate dropping, so the interest rate may start declining as well. So I think that with a judicious choice of policies, And I should say, of course, with the political scenario, the scene becoming more stable, the country can do economically very well. But obviously the questions that I mentioned, including the scandals, corruption scandals, the political situation, those are big questions.
Europe has faced like a quite dramatic situation as well, like for the past years with after the global economic crisis, and it's been like somehow persistent. What's one of the steps that the Brazilian government is trying to pursue now is like adopt policies in order to make the fiscal situation, to bring fiscal debt under control, because it has increased a lot, and to put a cap on spending. Some critics say, well, maybe this is not like the best moment to do this, considering that the economy is already in a deep recession. If we look, for instance, at Europe's example, what's like the correct conclusion? I mean, is it really bad to pursue fiscal measures that like put a cap on spending during a crisis? Will it is there a risk that it will make things even worse or not?
I think there is a short run versus long run consideration. In the short run, you're absolutely right that when an economy goes into a downturn, economic downturn, that the government should pursue a counter-cyclical policy, meaning it should spend more and compensate for the decline in the private sector activity. And in a way, it has been happening in Brazil over the last 7 quarters of the decline or so. And that's good. And in the short run, one probably needs somewhat more about it. The problem is the medium and long run, because this is not really sustainable. So in the periods when the economy is doing well, the government should in a way run surpluses in order to pay back the debt, reduce the deficits, and make them into surpluses. There's also another question, and that's important, and that is, I think Brazil does have an element of problem of inefficient allocation of capital, that some of the capital is invested in a way that doesn't yield very high returns. The rate of innovation could be higher than it is. Total factor productivity, the efficiency of allocating labor and capital into production, has not been as high as in some of the other economies. So for any given level of spending, the efficiency of it needs to be increased.
Mm-hmm. Why do you think that like this capital hasn't been like invested as it should? What are the problems that you see?
So some of it, I think, has been part of quickly putting together packages that may be socially beneficial, but are not necessarily carefully calculated in terms of the benefit-cost analysis. Some of the activities of development banks like BNDES in the past may have been geared more towards allocating capital to activities that looked important but were not really as efficient as they should be. So I think this needs to be re-examined, and I think the economy can grow much faster, and therefore the debt problem becomes alleviated if investment is efficiently allocated. There's one other aspect that's important, is at this point the savings rate, and therefore the amount of domestic investment, is somewhat limited for a country that's at the level of development of Brazil. So in a way, more trust in the government will also generate more savings and more investment, both domestic and from abroad. So an imperative is increase the functioning of the government institutions so that the trust by people, both from inside Brazil and from investors from the outside, returns.
It's interesting that foreign direct investment hasn't been like dramatically reduced in the past years. This is like one of the interesting things. Why do you think that?
It's interesting. So talking to people who are investors here, many of them have a somewhat longer term perspective, and they also believe that the current political problems and the uncertainties connected with it will get resolved. So interestingly enough, they see Brazil as already going through a process that's going to lead to a better business environment, and they are being here essentially expecting a positive outcome.
Mm-hmm. Should the level of investment that Brazil receives be higher, given like the size of the
I think
economy?
It can be.
What do you think?
I think it can be. You know, Brazil is a large economy. It has natural resources, so it's endowed both in human capital, you know, people, labor force, natural resources. It can certainly absorb more capital, definitely.
You wrote quite a lot about like Eastern European economies. You're from the Czech Republic, which is one of the countries that managed to make a successful transition from communism to capitalism and adopt like reforms that fostered economic growth. What are the lessons? Which are the lessons that like what happened in Eastern Europe? Which are the things that were done there that could actually be like replicated in countries such as Brazil?
Yeah. So I think Brazil has a big advantage that it's not starting all the way from the centrally planned communist system. It started already from a market system, and has therefore some of the key institutions and functioning economy that just needs to be, if you want, improved, repaired, as opposed to completely changed. So what happened in Central Eastern Europe was that there was this major systemic transformation from centrally planned communist system to a market system. And I think what helped there was the determination that people really wanted to make this shift in the regime, were willing to take sacrifices, temporary sacrifices, and indeed in many of these countries real wages went down temporarily a lot before resuming an upward trend. And the economists who were undertaking the changes had a good sense in the sense that they modeled their economy after the market economies and had the incentive for undertaking the changes to enter the European Union. So there was, in a way, perhaps not the best initial conditions, but what would we call the terminal conditions. The goal as to where they wanted to go was clear-cut. They wanted to become part of Europe, of the advanced part of Europe.
So this was an important driver.
That was important.
This is something we lack, maybe.
Yeah, in a way, But on the other hand, I think Brazil has, understood where it wants to go. It doesn't want to copy any single country, but on the other hand, wants to be, democratic, rich society that's efficient and rich on the basis of efficiency. So that's, I think, the discussion right now. The other advantage that you have in Brazil is that many of your people in key positions, be it in the policy-making circles, be it in the private sector, non-government organizations, have studied, traveled around the world, so they are global citizens. They understand what's going on and can therefore make decisions that are informed by what's going on everywhere.
Mm-hmm. But it's been difficult to translate this into practice. And it's not only for the past 5 or 10 years, because Brazil has... It's been difficult for Brazil to raise, for instance, its level of income in relation to developed countries for 3 decades now. So
yes. It is, I would say, where your initial handicap, so to speak, is you weren't in central planning, but you were in a mode that was what's called import substitution. So the economy from the 1950s on was really operating with enough protection to trade in order to generate domestic industry. And it's always difficult to switch from that mode to an open economy that really is open to competition and really imports a lot, exports a lot, right? You have companies that do it. Embraer is a good example of a company that exports, imports, competes worldwide. Right? So opening up to competition and changing the institutions that have existed for a long period of time can be difficult, because it's not like having an inferior system like central planning proved to be and saying there's no alternative but going the other way. You have to judge which institutions, which regulation to discard, to get rid of, and which to place in its place.
What does like academic research shows us in terms of like the importance of openness to trade, to investment, in order to achieve like higher economic growth? I'm asking you this because Brazil, it's still a quite closed economy.
Exactly.
How crucial would it be like to change this?
No, I think it is important. It's important to do it, perhaps not overnight in the sense that you do it in a drastic way, but to do it with a predetermined schedule, in other words, indicating that this is the way we're going and we're gradually reducing all the protectionist, or if you want, barriers that may be there. They need not be tariff, they could be non-tariff barriers and so on, permits and so on. So improving the business environment inside the country will actually enable the firms to improve efficiency and be competitive externally as well. But there is really no reason why Brazil, as an economy which is powerful as it is, why it couldn't be doing extremely well internationally. And in fact, China is a good example of another large economy that started way behind and is moving ahead relatively successfully, in part because it is, moving to the world markets.
But doesn't like in the case of China, the fact that it has like completely different political system makes a difference. Many people mention, for instance, Chile as a very successful example in Latin America.
Chile is a good case.
Reform,
yes.
but it also has done a lot, like during a period of
the Pinochet era,
authoritarian regime.
Right. The start was there, but what was important in Chile was that when the democratic regime came in, it kept some of the initial steps that were taken and built on top of it. Right? In a way, you had, in a different way, the parallel to it during the first term of Lula's government, where it did not completely abolish what was done before, but rather continued building on that. So in that sense, Brazil knows that it can be done. It did it in the past, it can do it in the future.
Many Brazilian economists have been discussing more recently the role that interest groups might play in the sense of hindering economic reform.
Yes, that is a serious issue, not just in Brazil, but in other economies as well. And indeed, again, opening up means that you're reducing the power and influence of specific interest groups. But it's not enough. One has to, indeed, in the system, have checks and balances and try not to give any particular interest group or single company monopoly power, be it directly in the market or influence buying or otherwise arranging for it. So yes, indeed, from the standpoint of the welfare of the society, of the people, one wants to have an economy that's efficient, that's well-functioning. People can make good wages, profits, and so on, but not extra normal, not ones that are at the expense of others.
Mm-hmm. Can you remember like a case of a country which was like successful in dismantling this kind of like interest groups and
Yeah, so I think the Central Eastern European countries that you mentioned would be a good example where initially they started as totally closed economies, and obviously there were interest groups from the old regime that were sort of powerful and so on. The first decade there were all sorts of excesses and distortions, but gradually as they opened up to international trade and competition, those became much less important, and in a way these economies now are totally integrated in the European market, so there are no tariffs, no barriers, everything moves very, very successfully. You can find other economies in Asia as well that started that were quite close and are gradually opening up, Korea being the most recent example. For the longest time it could not, South Korea, enter OECD because it had too much protection, but it has gradually reduced the level of protection, opened up. The chaebols are there but no longer have the power that they had before, and so Korea is part of the OECD group.
Do you think that the world has become like a more difficult place where like to operate with like supposedly an increase of anti-globalization feelings?
Yes. So I think what one has to realize is that yes, with globalization, the world is much more complicated. Things move faster, capital moves very quickly, goods, services can move, right, with the digital economy that's magnified and so on and so forth. So we live much more in a world of flows. Things flow in, out very quickly, and to construct a system that's stable for the citizens of any given country when it's based on flows rather than stable situation, is obviously much more difficult. On the other hand, the world has become richer as a result of globalization, so that's a positive aspect. The negative one that you started mentioning is that the benefits have been distributed in an unequal way, and in a number of countries, the middle classes, especially in the richer countries, felt, and in some cases, indeed, there wasn't just a feeling, didn't really have their incomes growing at all, while they see that the very rich are doing quite well. In a number of economies, China is a good example, you had a rise of the middle class that wasn't there before. So one has to realize that on the worldwide scale, there was an improvement in the living standards, but not evenly distributed.
People were not like completely convinced about like these benefits, considering like Brexit and the election of Donald Trump.
You're absolutely right. And further, I think in France, Marine Le Pen getting considerable support. So you're right. See, the populist movements get their support indeed from this perception, which they augment through their obviously public relations, that things are not going well, right? And in a number of countries that's visible, and as you said, the election of Donald Trump exemplifies that in the United States, and we see it in terms of Brexit, we see it in terms of rise of the populist movements, nationalistic movements, and so on.
What are the risks for emerging markets under this context?
So I think that really what we have to watch out for is that the world trading system not get disrupted. Because what we, for instance, see in the rhetoric of Donald Trump and some others is a tilt towards protectionism, indeed responding to what many of the people that feel left behind are saying, look, our jobs are going away, our wages are not rising, and so on. And indeed, those phenomena are there. On the other hand, as I mentioned, the world is much richer as a result of trade and generally interaction in the world economic activities going globally, and it would be really unfortunate for the emerging markets if the advanced economies, which represent some of the most important markets for the emerging market economies, if the advanced economies close themselves up, either literally through tariffs or non-tariff barriers and so on and so forth. So I think that really the elites, in the good sense of the word, around the world should try to prevail in the sense that we should keep the world open.
For a country such as Brazil, which hasn't managed to catch up in terms of income convergence, has it become more difficult to do so, or?
I would say yes and no. Yes, in the sense that the world is advancing faster. So if you're moving ahead and you're walking, but the others are running, well, you're falling behind, right? So in a way, I think Brazil has to do even more of what it's doing, namely advancing, for instance, to give you an example. In the world, we see that countries that do well because there are lots of new firms coming in and not well-performing firms leaving the market. So there is this turnover, and that brings about a lot of innovation, improvement in productivity, and so on. Brazil does not have that much of this movement. Okay, so we talked about the allocation of capital and so on. This is precisely it. So this would be one way to stimulate it. Or Brazil has really made tremendous steps in terms of providing virtual universal education to everybody. Well, the next step is really to go beyond that and focus on the high quality education above that, right? And the high quality, I think, is important because what we see with globalization is that the model that seems to represent the world is one that's called the winner takes all, where people as consumers and everybody want the best, right? You want to watch the World Cup. You may go and watch the local team that's not so good if your son or brother is playing there, but otherwise you want to see that, right? You want to listen to Luciano Pavarotti, not necessarily your local thing. So in a way, you need to be excellent. Right? So in that sense, the emphasis on quality is what's important. And again, to take your one of your premier companies, Embraer, it's penetrating the fleets around the world because it's considered to be extremely good. I mean, it is very good.
This is one of the interesting and somehow disappointing features of the Brazilian economy is the fact that it hasn't managed to increase productivity, although, as you said, like education in terms of schooling years has increased dramatically. Do you think this is the explanation for this? Maybe the fact that schooling years increase, but not the quality of education?
I think that it's a significant part. We see that in many countries, when you look at the success, relative success, that it's the quality of education, the human capital is in the end the important part. In the United States, there was a study that looked at the composition of all of capital that the country has, and they find that over 70% of the capital is human capital. What people have in their minds, not the machines, not the banks, etc. Those are important too, but it is the human capital that really matters, right? So everybody knows it when one thinks of Zuckerberg and Facebooks and all that. Well, there's incredible wealth that's generated from a single mind, right?
It seems to be like a lot for a country to do like at the same time, right? So the challenge that Brazil faces is really enormous. Do you think that political crisis can actually help, in the sense that it increases like the sense of urgency?
I think so. And I think a lot of very good fundamental reforms are born in crises. So if this crisis is a catharsis that will help Brazil, cleanse itself and establish a political system, democratic system that's functioning well, it has one of the necessary conditions, a platform on which to build. Look, Brazilians are extremely smart people, so you don't have a problem in the sense that, you couldn't build. That's why I'm saying the country has incredible potential, right? You have smart people, you have resources, large area, you're connected to the rest of the world. True, you haven't exploited it enough in the sense of the firms doing it. But I think when you compare Brazil, say, to the United States, I would say Brazil has much more of a potential to jump forward because it still has all these unexploited potentials, inefficiencies that can be exploited. The United States, and I'll simplify a bit, has eliminated a lot of these inefficiencies. So it has to innovate, otherwise it cannot move forward. And that's tough, just to innovate and only gain from that. Whereas if you can both innovate and catch up and eliminate inefficiencies, you could be jumping very fast.
You were like a presidential candidate for your country like 7 years ago. What has led you to like...
So, it was very similar to this. I saw that the country has incredible potential, which I felt it wasn't fully realizing yet. The Czech Republic, before World War II, when it was Czechoslovakia, was one of the 10, 12, most advanced economies. It was one of the most industrial countries in the world. So it was there once. It was one of the top countries. Then after 4 decades under the Soviet-imposed communist regime, it became a less developed country, less developed economy. And now it's coming back. And my sense was that one could mobilize people and arrange things even better and faster. And that the candidate who was at that point the incumbent was not really doing so well. And so I felt that even if I run a campaign where it would be very hard to unseat him, just to start the discussion and get people thinking and talking about it will be important. And we did achieve it, and actually the outcome was very close because it was a parliamentary election and we had to go into a second election because in the first election, which had 3 rounds, we kept blocking each other. So it wasn't really until the 3rd round of the second election that he managed to get enough votes.
So may you stand again?
That's a good question. We'll see.
All right, Professor. Thank you so much. It was very interesting.
Thank you for having me.
Talking to you today.
Okay, thank you.